The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electronic hymn as Danielle Ross pushed a medication cart down the east corridor of Mercy General, her sneakers moving silently across tile that had been mopped at midnight. 18 months. That's how long she'd been walking these hallways at night, when the hospital shifted into its quieter rhythm and most people assumed the nurses were just there to refill water pitchers and answer call buttons. Nobody looked too closely at the night shift. Nobody asked questions. The antiseptic smell hung in the air like it always did, that chemical bite mixing with something else tonight, the faint copper scent of saline drips and the underlying mustiness of a building that had seen too many emergencies. She reached room 347 without hurrying, without announcing herself. The patient inside was an army colonel, recovering from a stroke that had stolen his words 3 weeks ago. His eyes were closed now, his chest rising and falling in that shallow rhythm that told her his oxygen saturation was holding steady at 94%. She checked the 4 line with the kind of precision that came from years of doing this work in places where 4 lines weren't conveniences, they were lifelines. Her fingers moved with surgical certainty, checking the flow rate, ensuring the needle was seated properly in the vein. No tremor. No hesitation. Just hands that knew exactly what they were doing. The colonel's chart sat on the bedside table. Colonel Marcus Hayes, she read silently, her eyes catching his unit designation. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. She'd known that name once. Known it the way you know the names of people you trusted with your life. She stood there for exactly 3 seconds, her hand resting on the bed rail. Then she turned and walked back out into the hallway without waking him. Danielle had rotated her shifts deliberately for the past 4 months. Tuesday through Thursday nights, skipping Mondays when the visiting hours ran late and when Hayes's commanding officer came by, the same man who'd once pinned a commendation on her chest in Kandahar, the same man whose eyes would recognize her if they met for more than 2 seconds. She'd built her new life on the foundation of being invisible, and invisibility required precision. It required knowing which shifts to work, which hallways to use, which break rooms to avoid. It required the kind of discipline that most people would call paranoia until they understood what she was running from. The break room was empty at 2:15 in the morning, which meant she could open her locker without an audience. Her work shoes sat on the upper shelf, neatly paired. Her name badge hung on its hook, Danielle Ross, RN, the letters smaller than she would have chosen if she'd had a choice. Below the spare scrubs, folded with military precision, sat the combat boots. They were worn, their leather creased and cracked in places where boots cracked after 3 tours. The laces were still threaded through them, knotted in the way she'd tied them the last time she'd worn them in Kandahar, in a medevac tent where the temperature climbed past 110 degrees and the sounds of IED detonations rattled the metal frame of the tent like a drum. She didn't touch them. Not yet. Instead, her fingers found the small scar on her collarbone, right where the fabric of her scrubs met her skin. The scar was barely visible now, 15 years old, a thin white line the width of a paper cut. She pressed her thumb against it, a reflexive gesture, the kind of thing she did without thinking whenever the weight of her old life pressed too close. When she breathed out, it was measured. Controlled. The trembling that might have come to someone else's hands never reached hers. She'd trained that out of herself a long time ago. The hospital began to shift at 5:30 in the morning, that liminal moment when the night nurses started thinking about going home and the day staff began their preparations for rounds. Danielle moved through her final checks with the kind of efficiency that let her fade into the background. She restocked the medication cart. She filed the charts. She made notes in the electronic system with the sparse, precise language of someone who understood that everything written could be read later, analyzed, questioned. She wrote what was necessary. Nothing more. Dr. Sterling arrived at 6:47, stepping out of the elevator with his white coat already folded over one arm, his eyes already cataloguing the unit with the expression of a man who believed the building existed to validate his presence. He was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who'd been handsome 20 years ago and had spent those 20 years expecting that fact to matter. His hair was silver now, trimmed with the kind of precision that cost money, and his watch, a Rolex, probably, though Danielle didn't waste energy on details like that, caught the overhead light as he reached for a patient file. He paused. His eyes moved across the unit and stopped on her, and Danielle felt the moment his attention settled on her like cold hands. She didn't look up from the vital signs monitor she was reviewing. She'd learned this skill in places where being noticed by the wrong person meant complications that could ripple out for months. Dr. Sterling watched her check the fall line in room 346, and what he saw made something in his expression tighten. Her hands moved with competent efficiency, her fingers steady as a surgical laser, adjusting the flow rate without asking permission or explaining what she was doing. She didn't defer to him with her body language or her voice. She simply moved through the room as if she had complete certainty in her own knowledge. That competence, that quiet, unchallenged confidence, registered as a threat in the space behind his eyes. He didn't know that those hands had performed emergency surgical airways in tents that didn't have proper lighting, using equipment that was meant for combat zones, not hospitals. He didn't know that she'd pushed fluids and monitored vital signs for patients who would have died without her steady hands and her refusal to panic. He didn't know that the calm in her movements came from years of making split-second decisions while people were actively dying around her. What he saw was a night nurse who'd been at Mercy General for 18 months and had somehow earned the complete trust of every medical staff member who worked with her. Doctors asked for her opinion on difficult patients. Other nurses deferred to her judgment on medication timing. The respiratory therapists grabbed her when they needed a second set of hands on a critical patient. She moved through the hospital with the kind of authority that couldn't be appointed or claimed. It had to be earned. And she'd earned it by being better at her job than anyone else on the unit. Which meant she was better than him, and Dr. Sterling had built his entire life on the certainty that he was better than everyone. He set his jaw and turned away, moving toward the nurse's station with his white coat snapping behind him like something alive. By the time morning rounds began, by the time the hospital shifted into its daytime rhythm and Danielle was preparing to hand off her patients to the incoming day shift, Dr. Sterling had already begun a mental inventory of the ways Danielle Ross didn't fit the hierarchical structure he'd spent 30 years perfecting. She didn't seek his approval. She didn't ask his permission. She didn't seem to care about his authority the way the other nurses did, with that careful deference that acknowledged his superior position. But that wasn't what bothered him most. What bothered him was the moment when she was checking on the colonel in room 347, reviewing his medications with the kind of focused attention that suggested this patient meant something to her beyond his status as another body occupying a hospital bed. What bothered him was the way her eyes had lingered on his chart, on the unit designation, on the details of his service. What bothered him was that Danielle Ross had reacted to something about that patient, and he'd seen it, and he couldn't figure out what it meant. He filed that observation away. Dr. Sterling was good at filing things away, good at recognizing the small inconsistencies in people's behavior and storing them like ammunition. He'd built a career on knowing people's weaknesses before they knew the weaknesses themselves. And something about Danielle Ross's reaction to Colonel Hayes suggested she was carrying a weakness he could use. Danielle clocked out at 7 in the morning, stepping into the Portland drizzle that had started somewhere around 6:30. The rain was cool on her skin, gentle, the kind that promised to keep falling all day. She walked to the bus stop with her bag slung over her shoulder, and she didn't look back at the hospital. She'd learned a long time ago that looking back was how people got caught. You had to keep moving forward, had to commit to the new identity you'd built, had to never acknowledge the weight of the old one pressing against your spine. But she'd felt Dr. Sterling watching her, felt his attention like heat, and she understood instinctively what it meant. He'd seen something. Not everything, not yet, but something. And the moment someone in power started asking questions about who you were, the moment they decided you were interesting enough to investigate, the walls you'd built started to crack. Dr. Sterling pushed through the door of room for 12 without knocking, his white coat trailing behind him like a cape. Danielle was adjusting the cardiac monitor leads on the patient's chest, her fingers steady, her movements precise. The patient's wife sat in a chair against the wall. 2 adult daughters stood near the window. An elderly mother occupied the corner, her walker parked beside her. 4 sets of eyes turned toward the doctor as he entered. Nurse Ross. His voice had that particular edge, the one he reserved for public audiences. Is that regulation footwear? Danielle looked up from the monitor. Her hand moved away from the patient's chest. She glanced down at her shoes. Standard white nursing clogs. No visible damage. No deviations from protocol. She knew what was coming. "Yes, doctor," she said quietly. Sterling stepped closer, his shadow falling across the bed. He pointed at her left shoe. "I see a scuff mark. Right there. Our patients deserve better than someone who can't maintain basic uniform standards." He turned to the family, his expression arranged into concern. "I apologize you have to witness this level of negligence." The elderly mother's hand trembled slightly. One of the daughters shifted her weight. The wife said nothing, but her jaw tightened. Danielle took one measured breath. Her right hand moved to her collarbone, her fingers briefly touching the small scar there, a habit, a grounding, a moment between worlds. When she looked back up at Sterling, her voice was steady and low, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived much worse. "I've survived worse than your insecurity, doctor." The words hung in the room like a blade suspended in air. Sterling's face flushed red from his neck upward, a visible tide of rage. But something in her eyes, something unmistakably dangerous behind the quietness, made him pause. He turned and left without another word, his footsteps sharp against the tile floor. Danielle finished adjusting the monitor leads. She documented her findings on the chart. She checked the fall line. She never looked at the family again, but she heard the elderly mother whisper to her daughter, "Did you see the way she spoke to him?" The shift continued. 3 hours later, Danielle entered the break room during her scheduled lunch period. 4 nurses were clustered around a table near the window, laughing about something on someone's phone. The conversation stopped mid-sentence the moment she walked in. All 4 turned to look at her. Then, without speaking, they gathered their things, lunch containers, phones, papers, and left the room in coordinated silence. The fluorescent lights above hummed their endless electronic song. Danielle sat down at the now empty table with her sandwich. Turkey and mustard on wheat bread, the same lunch she'd made at 5 a.m. before her shift started. It tasted like nothing. It tasted like being erased. She ate anyway. She ate because eating was professional. Eating meant she wasn't crying. Eating meant she was fine, was managing, was exactly the kind of nurse who could absorb isolation with one measured breath and keep walking. 2 days later, Sterling posted something new on the unit board. The official performance review. Danielle's name at the top. And beneath it, in his careful handwriting, lacks initiative. Minimal team contribution. Does not demonstrate leadership qualities expected at this level. The day shift gathered to read it like a crowd at a public execution. Danielle watched from across the corridor. She saw their eyes flick from the words to her face, waiting for a reaction, waiting for something to break. She walked past the board, saw the review, and kept walking. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That was all. That was everything. Sterling was waiting for her near the medication dispensary. He stepped into her path, his arms crossed, his voice pitched low so only she would hear. Something to say, bedpan. The nickname landed exactly as intended, a deliberate, public cruelty, the kind that transforms a person into a thing. Danielle stopped. She turned to face him. For a moment, something flickered behind her eyes, something with the quiet intensity of a predator assessing prey. Then it was gone. "No, doctor," she said. She continued to the medication dispensary. She pulled up her patient list. She worked through the rest of her shift with the kind of mechanical precision that comes from shutting down everything except the task in front of you. At 9 p.m., as she was restocking supplies in the crash cart, she heard Sterling's voice from his office, pitched low but carrying down the hallway. "Yes, hello. I need to speak to the board president." "No, it can't wait." A pause. "I have concerns about a staff member on my unit." "Danielle Ross." "Yes, I said Ross." Another pause, his tone shifting into something almost conspiratorial. "Her judgment is questionable." I'm not sure she's stable enough for this level of responsibility. Danielle's hands continued moving methodically through the supply cart. Epinephrine, atropine, amiodarone, each medication went into its designated slot. She didn't stop. She didn't react. But her fingers were moving with the precise control of someone who had once checked weapons before they entered a combat zone, each movement deliberate and final. What happened next didn't arrive as a bang or a scream. It arrived as screaming. It arrived as chaos distilled into pure sound. Tuesday night, 11:19 p.m. The ER entrance doors exploded inward. A man, 250 pounds of muscle and meth, his eyes the size of quarters, his pupils dilated to black holes, crashed through the threshold wielding a kitchen knife. The blade caught the overhead light, throwing a reflection across the tile floor. "I need OxyContin." His voice was raw, desperate, the roar of someone in pain beyond pain. "They won't give me anything. Someone give me something." He overturned a crash cart. Medication scattered like playing cards. Bottles rolled across the floor, some shattering, their contents pooling and mixing into a toxic soup. A vase of flowers, someone's attempt at making the ER feel less like a place where people died, crashed against the wall. Water cascaded down the tiles. Every instinct told everyone to run. Doctors disappeared through the pharmacy door. Nurses sprinted for the stairwells, their shoes slapping against tile in a percussion of survival. A patient in a wheelchair was left abandoned near the vending machines, his face frozen in shock. Security was 2 floors away, responding to a call at the psychiatric unit. The ER was approximately 60 seconds from being completely empty. Danielle stood at the nurse's station, her back to the chaos, one hand on the edge of the counter. She heard the screaming. She heard the crashing. She heard her colleagues running past her, calling for her to move. She didn't move. She turned slowly and looked at the man. Really looked. Not at the knife. Not at the size of him. At what was behind his eyes. She saw someone drowning. Someone who had been denied help so many times that he'd stopped asking. Someone whose pain had become so vast it could only be expressed through violence. She walked toward him. 30 seconds, probably, someone later said. It took him maybe 30 seconds to even notice she was there. Danielle moved with her hands visible at shoulder height, palms open. The kind of posture that says, "I am not a threat. I am not running. I am exactly as calm as I appear." Her voice dropped to a conversational level, the tone someone uses when speaking to a friend across a quiet room. "Hey. Hey, brother. I see you. You're in pain." The knife hand shook. Tremored. A nerve fibrillation of desperation. "They won't help me," he said. His voice cracked. "They told me I'm a drug seeker. They said I should go to a clinic. It's 2 in the morning. Nothing's open. Nothing helps." Danielle kept walking. Each step measured. Each breath controlled. When she spoke, it wasn't the tone of a nurse speaking to a patient. It was the tone of someone who had stood in sandstorm winds at Kandahar, who had held pressure on severed arteries while rounds snapped past her head, who had talked a 17-year-old Marine out of his own panicked spiral using nothing but her voice. "I know. I know it hurts. But this isn't the way. You know that." The man's breathing began to change. Began to slow. His shoulders, which had been rigid with tension, started to lower slightly. "You know that," Danielle repeated, and it was a command delivered as a statement. "Put the knife on the floor. Right here. We can talk about what you actually need." She was 20 feet from him now. 15. The knife hand continued to shake, but it was lowering. His brain, flooded with methamphetamine and pain, was starting to recognize a higher authority. Not a uniform. Not a gun. Just a voice that sounded like it had authority carved into it by experience. 90 seconds from the start of the crisis. The knife dropped. It hit the tile with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. The man dropped with it, his body suddenly boneless, the adrenaline and desperation that had been holding him up evaporating all at once. Danielle moved in one fluid motion, the kind of motion that doesn't think about itself, that comes from muscle memory housed in a body that had trained for exactly this moment, and she had his arm controlled, his body positioned, her voice steady. Security! Now! They arrived 20 seconds later, finding her with the man on the ground, his arm secured, his breathing slowing toward something approximating normal. The knife lay 2 feet away, inert and harmless now, just a thing on a floor. The security footage would later be reviewed by hospital administration. The clinical director. The board president. Everyone would watch those 90 seconds in stunned silence, watching as a nurse who supposedly lacked initiative talked down a 250-pound assailant with nothing but her voice and the terrifying clarity of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. What they didn't know was that Dr. Sterling was already writing his narrative. Already positioning himself. Already making calls. Already reaching for the phone in his office to describe to his contacts on the board how concerning it was that a nurse had engaged with an armed suspect instead of evacuating, how reckless she was to have taken such a risk, how her judgment was fundamentally compromised. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was about to walk through the hospital doors wearing a doctor's coat and carrying a piece of paper that would change everything. Tuesday night at 11:47, the ER doors burst open and 250 pounds of muscle and methamphetamine came through screaming. The man's name didn't matter. What mattered was the knife in his right hand, the wild eyes, the voice that cracked the fluorescent lights like a whip. Medication. He wanted medication. He wanted it now. Security footage would later show him as a blur of aggression, a fist slamming the registration desk, a tray of instruments scattering across tile like shrapnel, the blade catching the overhead lights as it swung through empty air where a nurse had been standing 3 seconds before. The ER exploded into motion. Orderlies ran. Residents ran. 2 attending physicians backed toward the ambulance bay, their hands raised like they were negotiating with a bomb. A trauma surgeon called 911 from a supply closet. The lobby filled with the sound of retreating footsteps, the scrape of chairs being overturned, the kind of panic that comes when the threat is immediate and sharp and bleeding. The entire first floor of Mercy General moved like water flowing away from a stone. Everyone evacuated. Everyone except one. Danielle was in the medication bay when the screaming started. She heard it. She processed it. She didn't move toward the exit. Instead, she set down the insulin pen she was restocking, straightened her scrubs, and walked directly toward the sound with her hands visible and her posture open. The intruder was still in the lobby when she emerged, still swinging the blade, still demanding. His pupils were dilated to the size of nickels. Sweat poured down his face like rain. The knife had a serrated edge. 6-inch blade, military-grade steel, the kind you could buy at any hunting store for $30 and a cursory question about intent. He saw her coming and pivoted toward her. The blade rose. Danielle didn't flinch. She didn't accelerate her pace. She moved like someone crossing a parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon, like the knife didn't exist, like the screaming was background noise in a city she'd heard worse in. Her voice came low and level. Not loud. Not urgent. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst, and knowing in your bones that this moment had nothing on Kandahar. The next 90 seconds would haunt hospital administration. Security footage showed Danielle speaking. Her lips moved. Her hand stayed open. She never looked away from his eyes. The man's rage began to fracture. His breathing slowed. The knife lowered. Not because he was choosing compliance, but because her presence was doing something to his nervous system that his methamphetamine-flooded brain couldn't override. She was speaking the language of authority without using volume. Speaking the language of command without giving orders. She said something. The man's face changed. His shoulders dropped. The knife fell to his side. Danielle took a single step forward. 1. And then she moved. Her right hand came up and out, her hip rotated, and what happened next took 1.2 seconds. The knife was in her hand. The man was on his knees with his arm bent at an angle that made the camera operators wince when they reviewed the footage. He was crying. Not from pain. From the release of whatever pressure had been building inside him since he'd smoked whatever cocktail of chemicals had set him on fire. Danielle held the knife by its blade and set it on the nearest stretcher with her left hand, still maintaining pressure on his arm. Secure. Controlled. The kind of precision that comes from muscle memory so ingrained it executes in the space between heartbeats. She looked at the security guard frozen 20 feet away and said one thing: call Portland police. It wasn't a request. It was a command. And the room went dead silent. The next voice was the guard's, stammering into his radio. The next sound was sirens in the distance. Danielle released the man's arm gently, the way you'd lower something fragile back onto a shelf, and helped him to his feet with the same hand that had disarmed him. She guided him to a chair. She sat with him. She didn't leave his side until 2 Portland police officers arrived and took him into custody with the kind of efficiency that suggested they knew exactly what methamphetamine-induced crisis looks like, how it escalates, and what it looks like when it crashes. They didn't cuff him hard. They didn't treat him like an enemy. They treated him like what he was, a person whose brain chemistry had betrayed him. Danielle watched them load him into the ambulance, and then she turned and walked back to the medication bay where she'd been restocking insulin pens when the world broke open. The night shift nurses emerged from their hiding places. The residents came down from the upper floors. The attending physicians shuffled out of the supply closets looking like they'd seen something their medical training hadn't prepared them for. They looked at Danielle. She looked at them. And then she said, "Serotonin drop like that, I'd need some Jell-O too." She returned to work. That was all. No announcement. No explanation. No collapse. Just back to the medication bay, just back to restocking insulin pens, just back to the job that the people of Mercy General had decided she didn't belong in. But Dr. Sterling had seen everything. He'd come down from his office when he heard the commotion. He stood in the doorway of his private practice suite on the 2nd floor, watching the entire intervention play out on the monitors that showed the ER feed to senior staff. He watched her walk toward the knife. He watched her disarm a man twice her size with a move that looked choreographed, like violence was a language she spoke fluently. He watched the security footage replay. And in that moment, as the paramedics wheeled the intruder away and Danielle calmly returned to the medication bay, something shifted in Dr. Sterling's face. Not shock. Not fear. Recognition. He recognized that she'd just saved the hospital from a lawsuit that could have cost them $3 million minimum. He recognized that she'd done something that none of his credentials or board connections could accomplish. He recognized that the entire ER had watched a nurse perform an act of heroism that would become hospital law within the hour. And he recognized that this was his final opportunity to destroy her. He returned to his office and closed the door. His hands were steady as he picked up the phone. Karen Whitmore answered on the 4th ring, her voice irritated. She was in the middle of her morning golf game at the Waverly Country Club, and her handicap was 6, which meant her attention span for interruptions was approximately 30 seconds. Dr. Sterling used them efficiently. "We have a liability issue. The nurse who just engaged with that patient in the ER, she didn't follow protocol. She didn't evacuate. She made physical contact with a dangerous suspect. Insurance company is going to have questions." He painted the picture in watercolor instead of oil paint, letting her imagination fill in the catastrophic spaces. He mentioned lawsuit exposure. He mentioned the optics of a hospital that allowed untrained staff to engage in physical altercations. He mentioned that he'd documented everything, that he had concerns about her judgment, that this wasn't the first time she'd operated outside established guidelines. By the time he finished, Whitmore had already mentally drafted the suspension letter. She promised him she'd look into it immediately. She promised him the hospital would protect itself. She thanked him for his diligence. She called him doctor. That same morning, Sterling opened his laptop and composed emails to the nursing director at Swedish Medical Center in Seattle, the hospital where Danielle had worked before arriving at Mercy General. I'm reaching out regarding a former colleague, Danielle Ross, who's currently on our staff. I'm asking for background on her tenure with your organization, specifically regarding any concerning behavioral patterns or instability issues that might have contributed to her departure. The director responded within 2 hours, a carefully worded email that said all the right things while saying nothing. Danielle Ross served us well during her time here. We have no concerns to report. We wish her well. But Sterling knew how to read between the lines. If there had been nothing, the director would have been warmer. If there had been nothing, there would have been a phone call, not a forwarded email. The absence of enthusiasm was its own confession. He forwarded that response to Hospital Administrator James Chen with a note, see above. I think we need to have a conversation. By that afternoon, Chen had already called in Harold Chen, no relation, an outside investigator who specialized in healthcare liability and compliance breaches. Harold Chen arrived at Mercy General with a clipboard and the kind of neutral expression that made everyone he spoke with feel guilty regardless of innocence. He watched the security footage. He interviewed staff members. He sat down with the security guard and took extensive notes. He reviewed Danielle's personnel file and made copies of every disciplinary notation, every shift report, every piece of documentation that Sterling had accumulated over 18 months. By evening, Harold Chen had drafted a preliminary report suggesting that Danielle's actions constituted an unauthorized medical intervention and a violation of hospital evacuation protocol. The report recommended a suspension pending full investigation. By 9 p.m., the suspension notice was drafted and ready for signature. In room 347, Colonel Marcus Patterson's eyes opened for the first time in 6 days. His mouth moved. The words came out slurred but audible, Phoenix. Kandahar. The night shift nurse, a young LPN named Derek who'd been working critical care for 3 months, made a note in the chart, patient beginning to vocalize. Possible early cognitive recovery. He had no idea what those words meant. He had no idea he was watching the beginning of a secret unraveling. He had no idea that the woman who'd just disarmed a methamphetamine addict downstairs in the ER was the same woman whose military call sign was Phoenix, the same woman who'd pulled 14 men out of a burning convoy in Kandahar in 2019, the same woman who'd spent 18 months avoiding the one person in this hospital who could confirm she existed. Meanwhile, in a studio apartment on the northwest side of Portland, Marcus Ross, Danielle's son, Colonel Patterson's junior officer, a man whose mother had simply stopped coming home one day without explanation, found the apartment empty. Her night shift. Her note on the kitchen counter, typed, not handwritten, the kind of message you leave when you want to maintain emotional distance, working double shift. Don't wait up. He sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the room around him. Austere. Military in its neatness. Everything in place. Nothing personal. No photographs. No evidence that anyone lived here at all. He didn't know that his mother had come home at 4 in the morning after disarming a man with a knife. He didn't know that she'd showered in the dark so she wouldn't have to see her reflection. He didn't know that she was standing in her own apartment at dawn, staring at the only thing she'd kept from her old life, a pair of worn combat boots, desert tan, the leather cracked from 1,000 miles of patrol, the laces still tied from the last day she'd worn them in 2021. She touched the boots. Her hand shook. Then she put them back in the locker at Mercy General, beneath her spare scrubs, beneath the life she'd tried to build, beneath the identity she'd tried to erase. Dr. Sterling called Karen Whitmore at 7:48 a.m. on a Tuesday, catching her on the back nine at Riverside Country Club where she'd been a board president for 18 years and a woman who answered her phone for exactly 3 people, her husband, her cardiologist, and anyone from the hospital's executive suite. She was mid-swing when her phone buzzed. She finished the shot anyway, a habit of power, before checking the screen. Sterling's name. She walked away from her foursome and picked up on the 3rd ring. Karen, we have a liability situation at Mercy General. His voice carried the careful precision of a man building a case. The nurse from the ER incident, Danielle Ross, she engaged an armed intoxicated individual without authorization. She could have been killed. The hospital could be sued by his family if he'd been injured. Or by our staff. I'm concerned about her judgment. Karen listened while a breeze moved across the greens like something alive. What do you need from me? Documentation. I'm building a file. I want to know if there's a history of protocol violations. I'm calling her references now. I wanted you to be aware we might need to suspend pending investigation. The line went quiet except for the sound of distant thunder rolling in from the coast. Do it, Karen said. Document everything. If there's even a suggestion of negligence, we protect the hospital first. Sterling hung up, feeling the weight of institutional power settle across his shoulders like a cape. He'd spent 32 years cultivating this, the kind of authority that didn't require him to raise his voice, that existed in phone calls and signature lines and the careful architecture of plausible deniability. Within the hour, he had pulled Danielle's file and begun making calls to her previous employer, St. Augustine Medical Center in San Diego, where she'd worked for 4 years before transferring to Portland. He reached a supervisor named Michelle Voss. The conversation was a masterclass in implication without accusation. Michelle, I'm calling because Danielle Ross applied for a position here, and during our review, I noticed some gaps. I'm wondering if there were ever concerns about her judgment or her interpersonal skills. Any incidents we should know about? Michelle's voice came back cautious. Danielle was an excellent nurse. Why are you asking? We've had an incident where she made decisions without consulting senior staff. I'm just trying to understand if this is a pattern. There was silence on the line. Danielle never did anything without running it up the chain. She was one of the most by-the-book nurses I've supervised. Whatever happened in Portland, it wasn't typical of her. Sterling didn't thank her. He simply noted the call and moved to the next number, and the next, each conversation seeded with questions designed to plant doubt even when the answers were positive. Any concerns with protocol compliance? Ever notice her refusing direct orders? Any situations where she acted independently? By noon, he'd activated his second weapon. He'd retained an outside investigator named Wallace Chen, a former hospital administrator who specialized in finding liability in personnel files. Chen had reviewed the security footage and was already compiling a report arguing that Danielle's de-escalation of the intoxicated patient, the very act that had earned the silent respect of 3 ER nurses, constituted unauthorized medical intervention and failure to follow evacuation protocols. The argument was technically defensible. The hospital's policy required staff to evacuate and allow security to handle armed individuals. Danielle had instead engaged. The fact that she disarmed him in 90 seconds without anyone being hurt didn't matter. What mattered was that she'd violated the written procedure. And in institutional medicine, procedure was God. At 3:15 p.m., Sterling stood in Beth Warner's office, the unit director, the woman who signed the schedules and fielded complaints, and laid out his case. Chen's report was on her desk, 8 pages of carefully constructed argument that made a heroic act look like reckless insubordination. She put the entire ER at risk, Sterling said, his voice carrying the weight of manufactured certainty. What if he'd lunged? What if security had arrived and thought she was a threat? She could have been shot. Any of them could have been injured. And the hospital becomes liable for her deviation from protocol. Beth Warner was a woman who'd worked 30 years in nursing before administration had claimed her, and she understood what Sterling was doing. But she also understood something else. Karen Whitmore had called her at home the night before and made the hospital's position clear. Suspend her. Document it. Protect the institution. The machinery had already been set in motion. I'll process the suspension, Beth said quietly. But this isn't right, Sterling. It's protocol, he replied, and the words tasted like ash in everyone's mouth because they were both true and false at the same time. The next morning arrived grey and flat. Danielle had worked the overnight shift and was counting down the final 30 minutes when the text came through from the break room group chat, mandatory all-staff briefing at 7:15. She'd learned long ago that mandatory briefings before shift change meant nothing good. The nursing station was crowded when she arrived. Day shift nurses clustered in small groups, whispering. Security stood near the unit director's office. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their electric monotone, and the smell of strong coffee mixed with antiseptic hit the back of her throat. Beth Warner emerged with 2 security officers and made eye contact with Danielle from 15 feet away. Danielle Ross, you're suspended pending investigation into protocol violations during the emergency incident. I need your badge. The words arrived like something scripted, rehearsed. Danielle's hands moved on their own, the kind of muscle memory that came from accepting orders in 1,000 situations where resistance only dug the hole deeper. She unclipped the badge from her pocket and laid it on the counter. The plastic was still warm from her body. Across the station, Dr. Sterling stood with his arms crossed, his expression carrying the satisfaction of a man who'd finally won something that mattered. Please collect your personal items from your locker and leave the premises, Beth said, and her voice cracked slightly at the end because she was a good administrator who'd been forced to become complicit in something mediocre. The crowd parted as Danielle walked to her locker. 18 months of night shifts had accumulated into a small collection, the cracked mug from a Secret Santa exchange that said "World's Okayest Nurse," a dying succulent with brown edges that no amount of water could save, and the photograph she kept turned face in, a picture of Angela Chen in dress uniform, Angela's smile wide and alive. Angela who'd taken a sniper round through an apartment window in the Jolan district of Fallujah and never came home. Danielle placed each item carefully in a cardboard box she'd retrieved from the supply closet. At the bottom of the locker, hidden beneath her spare scrubs, lay the pair of combat boots, worn leather the color of dried blood, laces still tight from the last time she'd tied them in 2019 before she'd walked away from everything that identity meant. She left the boots where they were. Some things weren't worth carrying. Security escorted her out through the main lobby at 7:41 a.m. while the morning sun pushed against the eastern windows and made long shadows across the tile floor. The night shift watched her go in silence. Nobody called out. Nobody said good luck. Rain had begun to fall by the time she reached the bus stop for blocks away, the kind of Portland rain that was less a downpour and more a sustained promise of wetness. The shelter was broken, half its metal roof missing, and water dripped onto the cardboard box like a metronome counting down something final. Danielle stood with the box balanced against her hip and stared at Angela's photograph through its plastic sleeve. The rain began to soak through her scrubs, and she didn't move to adjust the box or step back into whatever shelter remained. 8 hours earlier, she'd been a nurse. A good one. Competent. Quiet. Invisible by design. Now she was suspended pending investigation for saving lives in a way that violated the script. The bus drove past without stopping, its lights blurred by the rain, and she wondered for the first time since she'd traded her dress uniform for scrubs whether running from PTSD and trauma and the weight of command had just been delaying the inevitable. Maybe the past didn't let you disappear. Maybe it waited for the moment you were weakest and then pulled you back whether you were ready or not. That same evening, for miles away at Mercy General, Colonel James Patterson woke completely for the first time in 6 days. His vision cleared like a fog lifting, and his first conscious thought was operational. Where am I? The second was urgent. Who's here? His son Marcus was sitting in the visitor's chair, asleep, his head tilted back against the wall in the posture of someone who'd been keeping vigil through the night. Patterson's voice came out rough, 3 days of post-stroke hoarseness grinding the words like gravel. Marcus. His son's eyes opened immediately. Dad. Hey. I'm calling the nurse. He reached for the call button. Don't. Patterson's hand gripped his arm with surprising strength. His eyes were sharp now, tactical, the eyes of a man who'd commanded 200 Marines in Kandahar. I need to know something. Senior Chief Ross. She's here. I saw her. Where is she? Marcus went pale. Your doctor? My nurse. Night shift. She was here 3 days ago. Patterson's jaw clenched. His mind was moving in fast forward, connecting pieces. I saw her face when I was going under. She looked at me like she knew me. What's her first name? Danielle. She's a nurse here. But Dad, she's never been military. She's just... Patterson's eyes closed for 1 second. 2. When they opened again, they contained a decade of recognition. Son, Senior Chief Danielle Ross saved 12 of my operators in Kandahar. She performed an emergency procedure under fire that shouldn't have been possible. She earned 3 Navy Crosses. Why the hell is she working night shift emptying bedpans? Marcus didn't have an answer. But when he went to find her that morning, all he found was an empty locker and a pair of worn combat boots hidden beneath spare scrubs, and a unit director who wouldn't make eye contact when she told him that Danielle had been suspended. The next morning arrived cold and bright. At 10:22 a.m., the sound came first, not words, not sirens, but the deep thrumming of rotor wash that made windows rattle like teeth chattering. 2 Black Hawks descended toward the north parking lot of Mercy General, their shadows moving across the hospital like something alive, like a predator finding its target. The sound was authoritative. The sound was final. 6 Navy SEALs exited the first helicopter in dress uniforms so sharp they looked like weapons, their boots hitting the parking lot asphalt in perfect synchronization. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They moved through the main entrance like water finding its level, their presence causing the lobby to shift and reorganize around them. The lead SEAL approached the front desk where a receptionist named Sarah Chen sat with her hand trembling over the phone. "We're looking for Senior Chief Ross," he said. His voice was the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. "Call sign Phoenix." Sarah's mouth went dry. "We don't have anyone by that name." "You have Danielle Ross. Night shift. Nurse. Where is she?" The question was phrased as a question, but everyone in the lobby understood it was a command. The rotor wash hit the parking lot like a physical force. Windows rattled. Car alarms screamed. 2 UH-60M Blackhawks descended toward Mercy General's north lot in perfect formation, their massive rotors churning the September air into visible waves. The sound was unmistakable, a deep, mechanical thunder that made every head in the hospital turn toward the windows. Orderlies froze. A nurse dropped a medication tray. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed and flickered as if the very building was holding its breath. Colonel Patterson had woken up fully 3 days ago. His first words after the stroke had been slurred but deliberate, "Where is Danielle Ross?" The room had gone quiet. A resident had stammered something about a nurse, and Patterson's eyes, the sharp, unflinching eyes of a man who'd commanded 847 Marines across 2 deployments, had fixed on the doorway with the kind of intensity that made people uncomfortable. He'd been asking variations of the same question ever since, growing more insistent each time. But it wasn't until this morning, when the hospital administrator had finally checked the employment records, that anyone realized what Colonel Patterson actually knew. By then, he'd already made a call. One call. To someone very specific. To someone whose voice carried the weight of command across classified channels. The hospital doors burst open. Not rushed. Not chaotic. Controlled. Precise. 12 Navy SEALs in dress blues entered the main lobby in a formation tight enough to cut with a knife, their uniforms midnight blue with gold buttons gleaming under the lights, their posture the kind that made regular people instinctively step aside. They moved like apex predators dressed for a wedding. The lead operator, Commander Price, had the kind of weathered face that came from 15 years of operations in places that didn't appear on maps. He walked straight to the information desk. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud. It didn't need to be. "We're looking for Senior Chief Ross. Call sign Phoenix. She works this hospital." The volunteer at the desk stammered. An administrator was called. More administrators appeared. No one seemed to know what to do. You didn't just have Navy SEALs show up in your hospital asking for someone by a military rank and a call sign. But that's exactly what was happening. Price checked his watch, a military Garmin, face plain and functional, and waited with the patience of a man who'd waited in worse places. The officers huddled. The SEAL team stood motionless, their presence in that clean, fluorescent-lit lobby something like watching wolves stand perfectly still in a petting zoo. Room 347 overlooked the parking lot. Marcus had been watching the Blackhawks land through the window, his jaw slack with the kind of confusion that comes from seeing military helicopters descend toward your mother's workplace. He was still in a hospital gown, still moving carefully, his commander's body not yet fully recovered from the stroke. But his mind was sharp enough to recognize the sound of a combat insertion when he heard one. He'd turned to the hallway and seen them, the blue uniforms, the precise formations, the officers moving through the hospital like they owned it. And then he understood. Marcus had pulled on the clothes his sister had brought him that morning. His legs felt weak, his coordination still slightly off from the neurological event, but he moved anyway. Down the corridor. Past the nurses' station where everyone was whispering frantically. Toward the main lobby where Commander Price was in conversation with the hospital administrator, who looked the way people look when their entire worldview had just been fundamentally reorganized. Marcus appeared in the doorway wearing jeans and a button-up shirt, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who'd just survived a major medical event. Price's eyes locked on him. "That him," one of the operators said quietly. Price nodded. They'd been briefed. Colonel Patterson's son. Former patient. Current gateway to Senior Chief Ross. Marcus walked toward the uniforms with the kind of courage that came from recognizing the truth before anyone else could deny it. "I'm Marcus Ross," he said. "My mother is." "We know who your mother is," Price said. "Not unkind. Just factual." "Is she here?" Marcus shook his head. "She got suspended 5 days ago. She's at her apartment. Northeast Portland. I have the address." The color drained from Price's face. Not because of the address. Because of the word suspended. Because of what that meant. Because somewhere in the classified briefing that had brought him and 12 operators to Portland, no one had mentioned that the person they were here to recall was currently under administrative scrutiny at the very institution they'd just landed at. Price looked at the hospital administrator with the expression of a man whose day had just become exponentially more complicated. But before anything else could be said, Marcus had made a decision. He looked at the operators in their dress blues, at the clear identification and authority in every line of their posture, and he turned back toward room 347. "Come with me," he said to Price. "There's someone you need to talk to first." Price followed. The 12 operators stayed in the lobby, their presence enough to make sure no one asked questions they weren't prepared to answer. Marcus led him back to the ICU, back to room 347, where Colonel Patterson, the man who'd started all of this by asking one simple question, was waiting. Patterson was sitting up in bed when they entered. His left side was still slightly weak from the stroke, but his eyes were clear as winter ice. He looked at Price, and something unspoken passed between them, recognition from a combat veteran to another. The kind of communication that transcends hierarchy and protocol. "Tell me," Patterson said. His voice still carried the rasp of someone who'd been unconscious for 2 weeks, but the command was unmistakable. Price pulled a chair close. "Senior Chief Ross. We need her for a recall. High-priority medical advisory for JSOC. 12 operators staging for a rescue in the Hindu Kush. She's the best trauma surgeon we've got for high-altitude fast rope insertions. The only one, actually." He paused. "No one told us she was suspended." Patterson's jaw tightened. "She was," he said simply. "Because she saved a life. Because she didn't follow protocol when protocol would have gotten someone killed. The same thing that makes her invaluable to you made her dangerous to the bureaucrats here." "Then we'll unsuspend her," Price said flatly. "We'll unsuspend her so hard the paperwork goes backward." It took 40 minutes to locate Danielle. Her apartment was 7 minutes from the hospital. Marcus had given them the address. Price had called ahead to the base, and someone had pulled her in less than 3 minutes. A small team dispatched to her residence with orders to stand by. She was home when they arrived. She was sitting in her living room in civilian clothes, jeans and a faded navy athletic sweatshirt, staring at the worn pair of combat boots that sat on the coffee table in front of her. She hadn't opened the box she'd carried home from her locker yet. She was just staring at it, as if the boots might somehow explain the past 18 months of pretending they didn't exist. The knock on the door came hard and professional. The kind of knock that comes from someone trained to enter spaces. Danielle opened it without asking who it was. Commander Price stood in the doorway in his dress blues, his command insignia visible on his shoulder boards, his face the color of polished oak and his eyes carrying the weight of authority that came from having ordered people into danger and brought some of them home. Behind him stood 2 operators in full tactical gear, their presence non-negotiable. "Senior Chief Ross," Price said. Not a question. A statement of recognition. "We need you." The world tilted. Danielle's hands went still. Her breathing shifted, not obviously, but Price was trained to see these things. The micro-adjustment of someone whose body just recognized that everything had changed. "I'm not," Danielle began, but Price cut her off with a single step across her threshold. The operators remained outside, giving space but making it clear that space was a courtesy that could be revoked. "Not what?" Price asked. His voice was conversational, but it had the texture of a tank idling in a garage, power barely contained. "Not military anymore? You're still on the books, Senior Chief. Until we deactivate you, you belong to us. And right now, we own you." Danielle's jaw clenched. "I can't, my hands." In Kandahar, after the 3rd tour, the PTSD got so bad I couldn't complete a surgical procedure without trembling. I couldn't trust myself with a scalpel anymore. So I left. Civilian nursing. No trauma work. No life or death situations. I chose stability. I chose. You chose bedpans over what you were trained to do. Price's voice had an edge now, not angry, but disappointed in a way that cut deeper than anger could. "But that's not the choice you made 5 days ago. 5 days ago, a 250-pound man high on methamphetamine came through these hospital doors with a knife, and you didn't run. You walked toward him. Straight toward him. And you disarmed him in 90 seconds. The security footage is everywhere now, Senior Chief. It's on the news. You didn't tremble. You didn't hesitate. You didn't doubt yourself." Danielle said nothing. "Your hands know who you are," Price continued. "Even if your mind spent 18 months trying to forget. Those hands didn't betray you in that hallway. They remembered their training. They remembered their purpose. They remember they belonged to a warrior, not a nurse." It wasn't until Price said the word warrior that Danielle realized her eyes had closed. 12 operators, Price said. Hindu Kush. Rescue insertion at 18,000 feet. Weather window closing in 72 hours. We need the best trauma surgeon alive, and that's you. Come back. Not as Danielle the nurse. Come back as Senior Chief Ross. Come back as Phoenix. The apartment went silent. Danielle stood in her living room wearing a civilian sweatshirt, staring at a man in dress blues who'd just named her ghost and asked it to come home. Her hands, which had shaken in the darkness for 3 years, were perfectly steady. "If I say yes," Danielle said slowly, "I don't come back to Portland. I don't come back to Mercy General. I don't come back to bedpans and 12-hour shifts and trying to be invisible." "No," Price agreed. "You don't. You go operational again. You accept the nightmares instead of running from them. You trust your hands because they've already proven themselves. You be what you actually are." Danielle walked to the coffee table. She picked up the pair of worn combat boots, the ones that had been with her in Kandahar, the ones that had been hidden in a locker for 18 months, the ones that had never stopped waiting for her to remember who she was. "Okay," she said. "Not a question. A declaration. I'm in." But that wasn't the moment everything changed. That moment came 2 hours later at Mercy General, when Hospital Administrator Marcus Caldwell was called into a conference room with the hospital board president. When they found out that 2 Navy SEALs had just walked into the HR department and informed them that Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross had been recalled for active duty. When they realized what that meant. When they opened her personnel file with trembling hands. 3 Navy crosses. The hospital board president's voice shook as he read the first one aloud. Caldwell leaned forward, his face going pale. 2 Bronze Stars. The room felt like it was tilting. Presidential Unit Citation for leadership during a mass casualty event in Kandahar that resulted in 12 operator saves. Caldwell had to sit down. In 18 months, Danielle had never mentioned any of this. Not once. They'd had performance reviews, medical board meetings, HR discussions, and she'd sat in that chair, quiet and composed, accepting criticism from people who had no idea they were talking to a combat veteran with 3 of the highest decorations the military awarded. Dr. Sterling was in the lobby when Commander Price walked out of the administrative offices with the hospital board president and 3 hospital lawyers trailing behind him like pilot fish behind a shark. Sterling was actually smiling, thinking he'd successfully orchestrated the removal of the woman who'd threatened his authority. He was thinking about her replacement. He was thinking about how order had been restored. Price walked directly toward him. The smile died on Sterling's face the moment he made eye contact with the commander's eyes. "Dr. Sterling," Price said. His voice carried the kind of quiet that comes from someone who'd given orders that sent people into places where death was the default setting. "I'm Commander Price. I command SEAL Team 3. Senior Chief Ross, the woman you just got suspended, is the finest combat medic in the Pacific Fleet. She's got 3 Navy Crosses, 2 Bronze Stars, a Presidential Unit Citation. She saved more lives than you'll ever treat. She is a warrior. An officer. A legend." Sterling's face had gone white. "And you," Price continued, stepping closer, tried to destroy her because she was competent. Because quiet excellence threatened your ego. Price paused. His next words came out like ice water. "This woman has more leadership in her left boot than you'll ever have in your entire career. That boot is upstairs right now, and it's about to walk away from this hospital forever. I suggest you find a new profession." The hospital board president, still holding Danielle's personnel file, had already made his decision. Security appeared. Sterling was escorted out of Mercy General by 11:24 a.m., his badge revoked, his contract with the hospital terminated for cause. By 2:16 p.m., the State Medical Board had received a formal complaint from hospital administration regarding ethics violations and retaliation against a decorated military veteran. By 5:16 p.m., his medical license was under review. 6 months later, someone spotted Dr. Sterling standing behind a folding table outside a Safeway in Portland. He was wearing a wrinkled button-up shirt. His shoes needed polishing. He was handing out brochures for supplemental health insurance, the kind that people took and threw away. His ex-wife had filed for divorce. His colleagues had stopped returning his calls. The medical board suspension had been finalized. He'd been fired from 3 consulting gigs. He'd aged 10 years in half. But Danielle was somewhere else entirely. She stood on the flight deck of the USS Theodore Roosevelt as the Pacific stretched out behind her like a carpet of hammered steel. She was wearing her dress uniform, the dress blues that actually fit her now, that belonged to her, her senior chief insignia gleaming on her shoulders. She wore the combat boots, the same worn pair that had been hidden in a hospital locker. They'd become part of her dress uniform. Everyone knew the story by now. The boots had made the news. The boots had become a symbol. The boots had come home. She was briefing a team of operators before a sunrise insertion into the Hindu Kush. Her hands moved as she pointed to a map. Steady. Precise. Exactly as they should be. The nightmares still came at 3:56 a.m. sometimes. She didn't run from them anymore. She sat with them. She let them be what they were, the cost of having seen things, of having loved people, of having lost them. But her hands knew exactly what they were for. Commander Price approached as she finished the briefing. The operators dispersed, moving toward their gear with the quiet efficiency of people who'd done this dance 100 times. "You good, Senior Chief?" Price asked. Danielle looked out at the sunrise painting the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson. She touched the small scar on her collarbone, the one that had started this whole thing, the mark of something she'd survived before she was even born, before she knew her own strength. She dropped her hand. "Yeah," she said, her voice steady as bedrock. "I'm good." The sun crested the horizon. The wind carried the salt smell of deep water. The rotors of waiting helicopters hummed with anticipation. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, call sign Phoenix, turned to look at the camera one final time. Her eyes held the clarity that comes from finally knowing who you are. "You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior," she said. "Sometimes the bravest thing is just being yourself." Then she walked toward the helicopter. Her boots, those worn, beautiful, sacred boots, struck the flight deck in a rhythm that echoed across the water like a heartbeat coming home. If you're enjoying the story so far, hit that like button. And I'd love to know, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from.